In this episode of the podcast, we're talking to one of my new friends, Glen, or as I should say, Dr. Hong. So Glen holds a PhD in psychology. He has over 25 years of experience when it comes to counseling, relationship coaching, trauma therapy. He's written numerous textbooks, best-selling books, and he's also a professor at Whittier College. So yeah, he has a good amount of experience. But he also happens to live you heard me, 3 doors down from me. And I didn't actually meet him on my own. I met him through Justin, who happened to be out on a run, runs into Glen, spends 2 minutes with him before he's introducing him to me. And by the time Glen and I are hanging out, we realize just how much we have in common. So yes, in this episode, we're going to talk about relationships, but I also want to talk about just Glen's overall experience, choosing psychology, what he's learned in his years of counseling and therapy, and also his approach to therapy, which I find quite unique. He calls it the upside down approach, but I'm going to let him explain all of it. So let's go ahead and jump in. All right, my friend, welcome to the podcast, dude. It is great having you in here. I appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Yeah. So I would love for you to kind of, because your credentials and experience in the space of personal development and counseling and coaching are pretty extensive. I'd love for you to kind of walk through this a little bit, who you are, what you do, all of that.
So I'm a clinical psychologist, and I've been basically doing therapy for about 20 years from a traditional model sense. And then I'm a professor for 10 years.
Okay.
I'm still teaching right now. But basically, during the time in my practice, a lot of traditional models, it focuses on your thoughts, which then create your feelings, which then create your actions, right?
Yeah.
So everything is thought-oriented, and it's about incremental change and changing your thoughts, right? But then once people get to a state where they feel emotions that transcend the rationale, like you can't rationalize it away, right? And the common principle in medical practice is that, hey, you know what? You're being irrational. Calm down. This doesn't make any sense. Emotions, you can't trust your emotions, right? But what I'm finding is that these are emotional triggers, and they're actually your signpost and guide to healing, because it's triggering a pain from your past, and you also have the opportunity to heal in the future.
Yeah. That's so interesting. Now, you and I met through Justin. We're all neighbors.
Yeah.
And apparently Justin just stumbled into, I thought he knew you better than he did, but he's like, hey, Glen, meet Pi, meet Glen.
I know.
We should all hang out. And I was like, cool, let's do this. And then we were actually hanging out, just the two of us, watching a UFC fight at my place. And I was like, so how long have you known Justin? And you're like, I just ran into him like for 2 minutes on the street.
Literally. Like I was literally just running by, and he was like, hey, I'm Justin. And I'm like, hey, how's it going? And then we just had a conversation. Then he's like, oh, my best friend Pi, you got to meet him, right? And I was like, sure. And then, we had that group chat, the text, right? And all of a sudden I'm at your house watching a UFC event.
Yeah. That is, I feel like, not an uncommon theme between us, where like, he's just that person that like is very outgoing, super charismatic and easy to like, everybody that meets him is like, oh yeah, like this is a super nice guy, and I want to get to know him. So then we started chatting about your background, and it's kind of crazy, dude. 20 years in, you said clinical therapy, right? Mm-hmm. Where was that at? Like, what was the focus of? Because there's so many different types of clinical therapy.
So I was all over. I mean, at first, I started working for the government. So I was dealing with like the chronically and severely mentally ill. I was doing suicide assessments out in the community.
Like government workers, or is it more like military or?
Government, like county, city type job. Okay,
so social
work, psychology type work. And then basically dealing with the chronically and severely mentally ill.
Yeah.
Suicide evaluations, doing suicide assessments out in the community. And then I transitioned into private practice. I was in Arcadia. I was in Hollywood for a little while, dealing with, a different clientele. They're not as chronic.
Yeah.
And it was more therapy focused. But within all of that range, there was just a commonality, right? So it was just figuring out what are these common themes, and what can I do, or what can people do to get better?
I see. And you are currently teaching as well. Where do you teach?
I'm at Whittier College, so I teach in the social work department.
Okay. And you've been doing that for 10 years as well?
Off and on, so at different colleges. But right now I'm at full-time at Whittier right now. And then I'm going to be starting my coaching program very soon.
Yeah, this is rad.
Yes.
And Anthony, can you actually pull up, because you have a book that's coming out too.
Yes.
So Anthony can pull up, we'll chat more about this throughout, but thatguyshouse.com/Glen Hong. When we were, and I'd love to go through what we kind of chatted about during the UFC fight, because I was like, tell me exactly how it is that you do what you do. Because I myself, I consider myself a student of psychology. I really enjoy studying it. I really enjoy learning. And specifically, I like to create frameworks that help people to succeed in different areas. So I would love to pull from you some of your insights in terms of succeeding in personal development in this conversation. But going back, psychology itself is such a new field. I mean, compared to everything else, Freud was kind of the very first of this modern day psychology, right?
Yes.
And this is 150, 200 years ago?
Absolutely. And either people tried to either follow what he was saying or they would try to disprove it. So that's why you have all these different therapy models that focus on either past-oriented models, like to heal your present, you have to address the past, or present-oriented models that say, the past doesn't matter, just focus on the present, and if you do that, then you can fix all your problems.
Yeah. What's interesting is that, so at least from the book that I wrote is really more based on relationships, and from a clinical marriage counseling standpoint, it's something like 84-85% ineffective long-term in creating change, which I kind of go back to. It feels like when you talk to a lot of psychologists, they're so deeply rooted in the rights and wrongs of their field, but the field is so new. And I'm like, how do we even, like, compared to engineering, which has been around thousands of years, we've been trying to figure out the mind for 200 years, like this. So I don't really get that mindset.
Yeah. I mean, usually, like, when you go see a therapist, right, a couples therapist, an individual therapist, they'll have like 2 or 3 models that they really believe in, right? And then oftentimes, like, if you have someone that's a little bit more seasoned, they can cater to what the client, like, what their needs are, right?
Yeah.
So, definitely you bring up a good point. A lot of times certain models will not work for certain people, or sometimes, like, it's just not a match, or maybe the person is just not very good, right?
Yeah.
But ultimately, like, for me, the reason I wrote this book is that ultimately your feelings, especially those deep-rooted feelings, like, have you ever had a time where you got so upset and then you just felt like, man, I just want to cuss everybody out right now, right? Like that feeling like, oh my God. And then if you
I'm there right now.
Yeah. if you do it, then there's regret later. You're like, oh my God, the situation gets worse, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then people are like, look, this was out of control, right? You're acting crazy, right?
Yeah.
The external acting out that's the problem, right? But the actual emotion itself is actually really healthy, right? Because that's coming from your nervous system, because it's a pain point, a trauma point coming out. There's something known as pleasure sensors in your brain. So for example, like pleasure sensors, if you eat cake, oh, this is so pleasurable. The pleasure sensors in your brain activate, right?
Yeah.
The other time it activates is when pain occurs, right? So for example, in physical pain, if a tiger were to enter this room right now, our body's gonna go in this fight, flee, freeze response, right? You're either gonna fight the tiger, run from the tiger, or freeze and hope and play dead and hope the tiger goes away, right? And the pleasure sensors in your brain turn on so that you can deal with the pain of dealing with this tiger, because you have to externally solve this problem, right?
Interesting. So these are the same. So your pleasure center is going off in those moments of fight or flight?
Fight or flight. So it either goes off during pleasure, it goes off during a physical fight or flight situation that's desperate, or you have to externally solve the solution, right? Because with this tiger, we can't internally solve it, right? We have to externally escape, right?
Yeah.
And then once your nervous system enters your emotional world, it does the same thing, right? So for example, that's why like people that, like, when a breakup happens, right? And then the person that's broken up with, they're like, oh my God, I got to see that person again. I have to have closure, right? And they keep calling that person over and over. That's a pleasure sensors turning on, because they're externally trying to seek that solution, and their pain is being triggered at the same time, right?
Yeah.
So that's a signpost that, look, you need to heal this and you need to get over this, right? And then once this person, if they keep externally chasing this person over and over and over again, saying that you are the solution to my problem, they're going to be in this constant pain cycle over and over again until they internalize it and say, you know what? I need more self-respect for myself. I'm going to have more self-respect for myself moving forward in relationships. Pleasure sensors turn off. They can move on and start to transition.
Yeah. And your philosophy is to use those triggers as indicators, like road signs, right? Like you're seeing these things of like, okay, their action to something caused me to feel a certain way. this is my road sign for, hey, I need to take a left right here and, change what I'm doing so that that doesn't become something that controls me.
Absolutely. But it's also being aware. So there's something known as proprioception. So, in psychology, you could feel emotions beyond your thoughts, right? So proprioception is feeling things beyond.
Yeah.
Outside of your body. You do yoga, you meditate, right? So those are experiences of proprioception. So once you have these triggers where you cannot just rationalize it, it's being comfortable with those feelings, recognizing it for what it is, and then being able to make a healthy decision.
I see. One of my favorite, we had this conversation and I remember asking you, okay, but Glenn, specifically, what does this mean? And I gave you an example. And my example was, one of the things that I wrote about was the concept of conflict resolution. And I have this feeling that it's not just a feeling, it's from research. People put a lot of emphasis on being good at resolving conflict for their relationships. And from all my research, being good at conflict resolution means that you're essentially a professional negotiator. You are a negotiator. I mean, that is somebody that is truly good at conflict resolution. And that the more important piece on that side is that either friends, couples, whoever, that you approach conflict in a similar manner. And when you approach conflict in a different manner, that's when, it becomes very difficult. So one of the examples that I gave you was Justin, my best friend. We have two very different ways of resolving conflict. Justin tends to just want time, space, and he figures things out on his own. I tend to be the person that wants to sit down, discuss, and resolve.
Right.
So when we both approach it this way and I reach out and I say, let's fix this. And he says just leave me alone, give me time. For me, it kind of brings up, well, are we done? Is this going to be, is this over? Is this and it's a very weird, irrational thought considering we've been friends 20 years and gone through all sorts of stuff, but it still occurs. And I have to squash this thought of no, we're fine. This is how he does this. This is how I operate. But you were saying that when that feeling comes up, that's an indicator of and you asked, do you have abandonment issues? And I was yes. So for you, in your approach to coaching or counseling, that would be the marker of saying, okay, what's going on right now is something that I need to address.
Absolutely. So Justin would be the trigger, right? Because he needs to pull away. That's how he deals with conflict, right? And then for you, it felt like you're being abandoned, right? Oh my God, is this friendship over? What's going on here, right? And then it kind of feels a little chaotic. I have to resolve this, right? Is that kind of how it feels?
For sure.
So once again, that's your pleasure sensors in your brain because you're trying to solve it with Justin, right? Versus, okay, this emotion, where does this come from? I'm not being abandoned. I'm okay. We can resolve this later. I don't need him to solve this emotional dilemma for me. I'm going to solve this by myself. And then once you do that and everything gets clear, then you can go back to him and just address whatever problem you have.
That's a difficult thing to do, especially when your past history would tell you otherwise. When you're coming from a place where most people that are close to you have done things that eventually destroy the relationship, you kind of expect. And that's one thing that I read about too, is people with abandonment issues will tend to actually leave a relationship before it's even over because they don't want to be the one to be abandoned.
But I think relationships are a reflection of who you are at the time. So you and Justin, very successful, you hold that bond, right? But also as friends, you complement each other's wounds, right? So he's a withdrawer, right? So when issues, he can't really talk about things, he has to withdraw. That's a wound that he needs to work on, right? So your conflict, when you talked about negotiating, once again, this is a traditional model of rationalize everything. Your emotions don't mean anything, just rationalize, right?
Sure.
Versus real conflict management with people you care about and people that you love. It's, we have to resolve these issues, right? But it's also resolving the triggers and the pains that's coming up, right? That's something that each individual needs to take accountability for, bring it to the table, and then real healing can begin.
I had one friend that I tried working with for a bit, and he was very fixated on the idea of healing past wounds. So much so that he spent, I think, 15 years just trying to heal past wounds. And the conversations that we would get into are like, but you don't understand, but you don't understand. And I would say, I would acknowledge and say like, you're right. Like I can't understand exactly what it is that, you know, and he would say, I need to find someone who can understand. And I would respond with, that person doesn't exist. Like the person that can actually truly understand what you've been through doesn't exist. And you can go and find one counselor after the next, but he seems to be fixated on that traditional path of like, you have to heal all these past wounds. But how do you even do that? How do you?
So, you know, once again, traditional models will say like, okay, if he's just fixated on the past only, and he's not using that information to address present issues and like really, you know, make conscious choices to improve his life, then he's just going to stay in that space, right? So there's something that I call the 3T cycle, right? The vicious 3T cycle. So the first one is triggers. So you have emotions that transcend your rationale, right? Those triggers come from the second T, which is trauma, right? Your past pains, you know, things that you haven't gotten over, maybe cyclical things keep repeating itself in your life, right?
Yeah.
Which then leads to the third T, which is toxicity, right? So in your present environment, you're going to have toxic environments and toxic relationships that reflect your past pain, right? So it's kind of tying in past and present, and then really looking at, okay, these people that are toxic in my life, I need to let them go because I'm also letting go of my past.
That's interesting because I don't know that he's been able to do that. I mean, it's been almost the better part of 2 decades that he's been stuck in this loop of you'd see those triggers and then he would essentially fall back into the same pattern. He would look for somebody to understand. Why can't you understand? And in the moments, and it can be really silly things like maybe being at the airport and somebody saying like, hey, we need to do a pat down. And he's like, this is racism. And I'm sitting here going, dude, they're just doing their jobs. Like not everything has to be that. Even though you've experienced that, not everything has to be that. And not every fight is worth fighting type thing. But he will fight it so hard that he puts himself into a really bad position. Let's say he's arrested because now he's belligerent, basically. And then he will blame the system of saying like, you know, this whole system is effed up and it's all this. And it goes in this like weird loop and he can't get out of it. And he's creating the chaos around him. But it's almost like at this point he's feeding off that chaos.
Yeah, I mean, he's living in this reactive state. So in the book Upside Down, like to me, that he's living in this disappointed, sympathetic state. He's looking for external solutions to internal problems, right? So everything is setting him off. He's reactive to everything, right? And so he's just staying in this toxic cycle, right? Toxic people, being triggered, not doing anything with it. And he's just living in his pain point constantly.
So what do you say or do to pull somebody out of that, to get them to, because I'm finding that in many cases, a person doesn't have the tools necessary to self-evaluate and to see from that perspective.
Yeah. So, I mean, it takes a lot of ownership. Like even in your book, you talk about complete ownership, right?
Yeah.
And in your friend example, he needs to take complete ownership of everything that he's doing, right? So in his current environment, if we assessed all of his relationships and the people that he's close with, he has to acknowledge and make the connection that, look, these toxic people in my life reflect the fact that I'm still toxic and I still haven't resolved my issues. And I also need to fix my present situation and figure out what I want in my life. So it's not just one or the other. It's actually doing everything.
Interesting. Yeah, that ownership piece is tough. I wrote that piece in there after, you know, a few of the people around me knew that I was writing a book on this subject. Excuse me. And over the past few years, I've had, you know, 20 some odd friends or contacts of friends kind of reach out and explain what's going on and ask for advice. And in so many of these cases, they were saying the words like, you know, what do you think I should do? Or, but when I would respond with like, I would say you need to make your own decision, but here's what I'm seeing. And then they would respond back with like, well, but don't you think that, you know, this person, they would basically be looking for verification. Like they would want me to validate their feelings of like, yes, this other person is complete trash and you should, you know, and when I didn't validate it, they would kind of almost redirect the anger. And so I wrote that piece in because I was like, how many times do we look for help, but we're not actually looking for help, we're looking for validation. And those are two very different things.
Yeah, so the two examples that you gave, so, the example I gave about the tiger, right, and that entering your emotional world, right? For example, if the tiger were in this room, would we be thinking about happiness at all?
No.
No, we're just, our mind is just going to be focused on how do I survive? What do I
Stay
do?
alive.
How do I get out of this, right? Because if you're thinking about happiness, you're going to die and not survive, right? It's all about the worst case scenarios, right? Oh my God, like I just got to get the hell out of here, right?
Yeah.
And that's what it means when your sympathetic nervous system or your fight or flight enters your emotional world. People are in this emotional loop. So instead of what do I do with the tiger? How do I survive? It's my life sucks. I can't do anything. I just got to get by.
Yeah.
Life is a disappointment. If you try it, your life is just going to suck, right?
Yeah.
So that is an example of your nervous system actually entering your emotional world. So those two examples, your friends are in this disappointed fight or flight state. The world is this terrible place where you have to react to everything and you just have to survive. And that's what I mean. Their pleasure sensors, their triggers are firing on all cylinders. And if they took advantage of those opportunities and looked at their environment, they could fix all of their issues.
That's interesting. So can I ask what made you want to get into this field?
So for me, personal development has always been a big thing for me.
Yeah.
And then my family upbringing was very dysfunctional. There was a loving family, but a lot of we're an immigrant family.
Yeah.
And there was just a lot of toxicity. There was a lot of trauma. On my mother's side, there's a whole history of depression and anxiety. So just the whole family dynamics in general, I became fascinated by why is this happening? I mean, most of it was just personal. I just want to survive this, right?
Yeah.
And then later on, as I became an adult, I would look at, the intimate relationships I had. I would look at even the job choices I made. Things that were very intimate to me, I would make decisions that would mimic my family lifestyle. And once I did that, I was like, damn, why do I keep doing that? Or even if logically I could be like, man, I'm going to do this because this is healthy. And then I have the choice to make a healthy choice. And then all of a sudden there's a choice that ooh, this feels so good. And that's my pleasure sensors firing, my pain point. But at the time I'm just like, oh, this is my instincts. This is the choice to make, right? And
are you comfortable giving examples of what kind of stuff you would experience?
So when I was working for the county for a while, there was two job options that I had. So one was because I was like, yeah, I want to be able to set my private practice up. I want to be able to teach. And then one was working with the courts, and they're the nicest people. And they're like, yeah, we'll accommodate your schedule. We'll do this. But it wasn't a promotion. They didn't offer me the promotion, but I didn't really care about the promotion at the time. I was like, yeah, I want to be able to do this. Then there was this other job. It was completely toxic. It was hectic. It was crazy. It's like a call center. And then, but it was a promotion. And then I'm like, man, something feels so right about this. So once again, my pleasure sensors were firing, right? Oh my God, this is an amazing opportunity. I ran home to my wife. I'm like, yeah, because we just bought a house. I'm like, see, I'm going to take the promotion and take the safety of this all. And then once I got there, literally it was just like home. I'm arguing, fighting. It got so toxic. I was getting death threats because I was getting a promotion. So people are sending death threats, F and die. My tires were slashed. And
because of your promotion?
Because of the promotion, and I was also getting all these other opportunities, right? So then it was just the same feeling, right? So instead of people oh, this is just a regular thing that happened to you, it's just by chance. And it was no, I chose this.
Yeah.
I created this experience and I take ownership for it. And so that became and then instead of the whole traditional thing, in terms of working through trauma or depression issues or anxiety issues, the whole traditional thing about self-esteem, so I tried to do the rational self-esteem thing or, the other advice that I was given, but it never really worked, right? It was just more for me, it wasn't about esteem as much as self-concept and having emotional expansion, being able to expand my emotional capabilities.
Yeah.
And so this whole coaching that I'm doing now is we honor every single emotion you have. So I'm not going to be the expert and tell you got to do this and you got to do this. Let's explore your triggers. Let's explore your environment. Let's see where you're led, right? And all the answers will emerge.
Yeah.
And then we do the therapies from there. If something triggers your pain, okay, let's go into your family dynamics. If this relationship, how does it relate? So instead of like self-esteem, like, hey, you're such a good person, we expand your past to your present so you can create a better future.
Interesting. I often feel like, well, number one, I do know a lot of people that tend to create chaos around them. I think that they're just used to it. They're so programmed to from like you said, from home experiences, from life experiences, that they naturally created. The person that I spoke about earlier was one of those, but I know probably 10 off the top of my head that do this. I don't feel like a lot of us understand how much emotional bandwidth all of this stuff takes up. My own, coming from my own experience, it was interesting. I've talked a couple times on the podcast that for a very long time I've had to, I've believed that, money is essentially energy. It's kinetic energy. It's stored energy for whatever it is that you want to do. Because I do feel like a lot of us have a very weird relationship with money, especially creatives. And they almost feel bad asking for it. And so instead I kind of say like, that $5,000 in your bank account, it's not $5,000. What it is it's a certain amount of stored energy. It is your ability to call on somebody else to provide for you, to do some sort of service, to give a product. And you go out and you give your energy to receive more of this stored energy. And the more people that you're generally helping, the more energy you're receiving. So that standpoint and that kind of mindset has been with me for a while, and it truly helped a lot when I went through my divorce. In that process, I zeroed out to maintain ownership in my company. I zeroed out. I bought back the ownership that your spouse naturally carries. Anything that you create becomes 50% owned. And if you're in a no-fault state, it doesn't matter what's going on. It's 50%. So I remember zeroing out and kind of thinking back to what I'm really doing right now is I'm giving up everything that I own to be able to buy back my energy. And if I can buy that back, then I should be able to really easily make that money back. If I have more energy to put out, then I should be able to get more energy in. What I didn't realize was how much of my emotional energy was going to the fixing the marriage, which I had been doing for 15 some odd years. It took me, I think, like almost 10 years to get to a place where I had $100,000 in the bank. And it just felt like I could never exceed $100,000. I don't know where the money was going. I was really bad with even watching it. I didn't want to think that it could be, my ex could be doing anything with that. I didn't want to even, so I buried my head in the sand. It took 10 years to get to that place. It took a matter of months to get back to it, like 3 months. And I was right back to where I was when it all, and I was like, how did it take 10 years to get there and 3 months to get back to it? Versus that was the first time that I had a tangible number on just how much energy I was losing in that relationship and in the toxicity. I don't think people, most of us understand that lesson. Like, at least I don't think they have a tangible number or something that they can put on it.
No, absolutely. And then, like you mentioned, money is energy too, right? So your relationship with money will also dictate, what's going on in your internal world, right? If you feel like you're lacking and you have less, your bank account, and you're hoarding the money, you're going to constantly lose, right? Versus making a decision, like even in your like financial wealth or your financial world and your marriage. I mean, to me, the story that I'm hearing from you is you let go of old belief systems about your marriage and what your life could be, and you transition to a higher plane. So the money was a part of that story, but ultimately you transitioned and you left, these old belief systems that were no longer serving you.
Those belief systems are very difficult to leave. I mean, that would be, what you just said is 100% accurate. And I also feel like it's understated, because what kept me there for so long was also religious beliefs, upbringing beliefs, like societal beliefs, in terms of, like, I used to be a very devout Mormon, and you don't divorce. You don't, what God has put together, no man should divide asunder. and all these different philosophical, religious beliefs that tie into your relationship with another person. And what was interesting is in that culture, you could explain the toxicity of what's going on.
It was justified.
But it's still like everybody's dealing with this, you know. And maybe they are. Maybe they are, and they're just like silently, you know, suffering. But you're encouraged no matter what. I mean, basically the only premise to ever leave is under violence. And I'm like, man, violence in many cases does less damage than emotional abuse and all the other things that could be occurring in a relationship.
Sure.
So, yeah, to go back to your point, after 14 years, there's eventually a turning point where you go, okay, everything that society says, all the repercussions that come from this, all the pain that I'm going to be creating in leaving is less than the pain of staying, and you make the decision and you start to see things differently. But so many people are trapped in these beliefs that they never actually escape them. For me, it took 14 years.
Yeah. But look at all that you accomplished though, right? I mean, you're dealing with societal norms, especially religion. Religion is a huge one. All of those things that took you 14 years, but look at your life now, right? You internalized it. You stopped seeking external solutions, right? And you made that decision for yourself. And that's ultimately what healing is, right?
Sure.
It doesn't matter the environment anymore. You're not seeking the environment for validation. The answers are within you. Your emotions are guiding you. So you used all that, and then now you're in a much better place.
But how do you help someone to begin that journey before the pain is so great? You know, that saying of like the pain of leaving, the pain of staying has to be more than the pain of whatever it is that you might be doing, whether it's health or whatever it is. The pain of staying the same becomes worse than the pain of doing something different. How do you encourage somebody to begin the process of self-development before that step?
So this is where I've changed. So before, you know, I'd be like, okay, the goal here is to prevent people from suffering, right? So the goal here is like, you know, if you understand these dynamics, you can make a much better conscious decision for yourself, right? And I used to be like, man, I'm pushing this and like, hey, you know, learn from me or learn from other people and don't do this, right? But what I'm realizing more and more is that even if a person stays, they still have work to do. That's why they're there, right? So it's not about this right or wrong or this like closed off space. They're staying because they haven't gone to that space or they haven't taken that next step to say, you know what, I'm better than this situation. I'm ready to move on. So they still have pain to work through.
Interesting.
And once they're ready, they'll make that transition.
That's a very interesting. So you're basically saying that, you know, they're staying because there's still significantly more to learn.
Yeah. I mean, you know, in your book, you talked about values, right?
Sure.
And so I look at values. I think there's two values. One, there's intellectual value. Like, for example, like, you know, when people decide to date, right? And they get into a relationship. And then their value is like, we're going to have the best relationship ever and it's going to be equal. And it's going to, so that's their thought value, right? But then once you get intimate with the person, right, they have their emotional values. And their emotional values, a lot of times they're not aware of it, but maybe they had like a really difficult childhood. So their emotional value is, I'm really needy and I need you to take care of me, right? And then there's a disconnect between their thought value versus their emotional values.
Yeah.
And so relationships help you work through your emotional values.
Interesting. The subject of values is one that I found fascinating because, you know, from a society and again going back to a religious standpoint and all the training that we get growing up, culturally, you're kind of, most of us are either taught or at least it's implied that you marry within your religion, you make friends within your race, and I get it. The thought process is essentially like, okay, we're trying to line up values.
Yeah.
And what I've come to realize over time is that the only thing that's certain about, you know, making friends, dating, or doing whatever, let's say at church, the only thing that's certain about the people that are sitting next to me is that more likely than not, they share different values, despite sitting in the same, you know, despite being part of the same religion, sitting in the same space. It's more likely that those people do not share my values than share my values. I find these weird mental shortcuts, and this has to, I'm curious if this bothers you, because these mental shortcuts that we use are so often things that we grapple with, like we hold on to as if they are life. And in reality, they are completely wrong.
No, absolutely. I mean, there's just a lot of, there's just a lot of bullshit, right?
Yeah.
You know, like even for me culturally, I was raised in a Korean American home. So I was told that you have no value unless you take care of us. And then you have to marry a Korean person. You have to take care of the family. And this is a status thing that shows, it's just very archaic.
You as a child has
son.
no value unless you take care of the family.
Oh yeah. And then people are like, you know, he'd be like, love is conditional. My parents would tell me this all the time. Love is conditional. And if you don't do what we told you to do and you don't take care of us and you don't like raise a family and you don't support us, your life has no meaning to us. And that was a message.
Wild.
That was a message as a kid, right?
Yeah.
So this whole construct of like no independence. So anytime like I would get independent, they would start acting out. And then they would take people away, right? Or they would like make threats, right? And even when I became an adult and I was taking care of them, the same dynamic was occurring. So for me personally, once I took ownership of like, okay, the partners I'm choosing, they're like, you know, because my neediness is coming out. So then I chose like the most withdrawn partners. So then I'm like, okay, cool. I'm choosing this and I'm drawn to this because I'm not being independent, right? Or like, you know, the job example, right? I chose that and I was drawn to that because they were taking away my independence. And once I started recognizing, oh, this is a pleasure sensor. This feels chaotic. This feels desperate. I'm trying to externalize the situation.
Yeah.
I was able to transition and move on. And that was huge for me. So instead of like self-help books and life advice and this and this and this and, you know, this inspiration, it became, I became the emotional hunter of my own pain. And once I did that, all of my answers were answered. And then no one else did that for me. My emotions did that for me.
Did that require a distancing from your family?
Yeah, I had to set boundaries with them. Like,
Yeah.
I didn't talk to them for years.
I see.
And then it became, so there's something known as differentiation in the family dynamic. So like there's like different roles in families, right? So if you have a dysfunctional family, okay, if you have a healthy family, rationalization is the key to success. So like, hey, how do you feel? Oh, how do you feel? Then let's reach a solution, right?
Yeah.
But in a dysfunctional family, the person that rationalizes is the weakest link in the family. And then you're going to be targeted, right?
I see.
And there's something known as differentiation. Differentiation is a person that has the ability to see the family dynamic as unhealthy, and they're actually more individualistic in their emotions, right?
Yeah.
They become the scapegoat of the family. So people target them for all of the family problems. So the person that is blamed the most in the family dynamic is usually the differentiated one and the scapegoat, right?
Interesting.
Then you have the other kids. There's the enmeshed kids. They're the ones that like they'll just do whatever the parents say, and then they're so emotionally involved, so they lose their independence. And then the other type is the disengaged, where they're just emotionally withdrawn.
Yeah.
And they're like, okay, I'm going to get the hell out of here when I'm 18. And then they don't emotionally invest whatsoever in relationships at home.
That's fascinating.
So like that whole dynamic, like, it all comes into play. Like it's all encompassing.
Yeah. What's really crazy to me is people, there's all sorts of different notions in terms of like what family is. There's people that feel like no matter what, this is family and we are always going to be there and this is family. I find that to be a very unhealthy balance because there are certain things where like you do need to create boundaries and set distance. And maybe with family, you give extra chances, we're going to take some time, but we're still here, 6 months, 12 months, year down the road, we'll figure things out. The other side is like, just no matter what occurs, we stay in close proximity, and that feels super toxic. But at this point, like where you are now, do you find that you're able to still be close with your parents while still maintaining that boundary, or do you feel like you have to make sure that there's a certain distance there?
So initially, like I was not strong enough to like, okay, I could see you and be okay. Like I would get really triggered when I used to go home, right?
Yeah.
Whereas now, like it's okay.
Okay.
It's okay. Like I would, like before I'd go home and like, oh my God, I'd be messed up for like 2 days.
Yeah.
Whereas now, like it's okay. Like I understand the process, and that's where forgiveness comes in, right? Like for me, like healing is also forgiving. And then see, this is the other thing. Like I've heard all of these forgiveness terms. Forgiveness is you're helping the other person, right?
Yeah.
You're doing it for you and it's going to set you free. But I was like, that doesn't work for me, right?
Yeah.
What truly ended up working for me, like where I could really forgive, is I became like the person I am now is, you know, and I'm a much happier person. That is much greater than the pain and the consequences, the things that I did, the things other people did to me.
Sure.
Where I am now far outweighs the pain and the suffering that I went through. And that's where forgiveness came. Like that was the definition for me.
Yeah.
Because I couldn't be this holy person in that spiritual space. I just couldn't do it. Like I couldn't, I tried to be that person, but it didn't work for me.
That's another one of those super fascinating topics, forgiveness, because people use that out of context regularly. And even when you take it back to like a religious conversation, if you take it back to religion specifically, forgiveness was defined as a change of heart. So it was defined as, you know, you are forgiven at the point where you stop a certain behavior. So you don't go asking God for forgiveness just so that you can do the same thing over again. That it literally says it in whatever Bible you are using, that is not the idea of forgiveness. So if you plan on, you know, killing somebody tomorrow, don't go ask, you know, say, please forgive me for killing someone today. And granted, that's a very extreme example, but people use the term as if you're supposed to forgive somebody who is actively continuing a certain behavior that is like hurtful. Like, I'm going to continue being whatever it is that I am and continue to hurt you, but you are responsible for forgiving. It's for your benefit.
Right.
And I always found that was, we have a tendency to continuously do this, like rephrase and reframe things to fit like our, but that happens a lot with that subject. And would you, from where you're standing, is forgiveness even possible when the offense is being repeated?
Yeah. So, you know, forgiveness, you know, once again, that's the definition for me, is that you're in a much happier place and your life is so much better that it far outweighs what you went through or what you did to other people too.
I mean, it's essentially that it doesn't matter anymore. You've
learned the lessons.
Yes.
You've emotionally expanded out. So like it was forgiving myself for my self-destructive behaviors, the things that I did, the things that were done to me, understanding that a lot of the things I did that were self-destructive came from a place of pain, right? And then also understanding that without that experience, you know, I'm happier now. Like, I used to watch those shows where people are like, oh, I would never change that painful experience. And I would be like on the couch and I'm like, hell no. Like, there's a better way. Like, you don't have to suffer. You can still be happy like that. But, you know, I get it now because there's an emotional expansion. That's something that, you know, once you're in this more expanded state, there's a lot more forgiveness that can take place.
But that's what's weird though, is because suffering is kind of the ultimate catalyst for growth.
Absolutely. Like
in almost every area.
Absolutely. It's like the rose, right? It needs the mud.
Yeah.
Right. It needs the rain. So that combination allows you to emotionally expand.
So from your work with coaching and counseling, what do you feel like are the things that are most commonly kind of stepping in somebody's way of progressing?
I think one is education of emotions, right? And then the second thing is everything that you need to know are in your relationships. And so like if you look at your most intimate relationships, whether like your partner, your friends, your family, all the things that are really important to you, everything is there for you. Your past pains, they're reflected in those relationships, and then what you need to do to get out and what you want in your life are all reflected and available in those relationships for you.
So going back to number one, what is education of emotion?
So for example, like in the book, we call it guided emotions, right? So remember like the tiger example, right?
Yeah.
If you fight, right? Fighting is defending yourself, right? So from that emotion, from the sympathetic response is deep anger, right?
Okay.
The second one is the flee response. You're going to run from the tiger, right? That is where the emotion of deep anxiety comes from, right?
Okay.
And then third one is the freeze response, where like you're playing dead. Please, tiger, don't notice me. Go away, right? That is indecision, where you have all these mixtures of emotions and you're so overwhelmed and you can't make a decision, right? So similarly, once again, if you're having these trigger emotions, one of these three, They're guiding you out. So for example, like, if you're really angry and you feel like you have to defend your emotions to everybody, your sympathetic system is involved, your pleasure sensors are firing, and then saying that you need to externally defend yourself to these people, right?
Sure.
But if you do that, you're in this survival mind state because you're saying, I can't do better in my life and I have to maintain what I have.
Sure.
Right? So once this person recognizes, okay, this is on because I'm trying to externalize this pain, right? I'm trying to solve it. I'm going to leave the situation. This situation is no longer good for me. So that deep anger, I'm going to move on. This is toxic. I'm going to move on. Or if you have deep anxiety, right? I'm going to run from this tiger, right? I'm going to run from this good opportunity. I'm going to run from this relationship. I'm going to run from this, I don't like public speaking or whatever the case may be, right? That is the establishment of independence. You can develop skill sets to develop your independence, right? And then the freeze response, which leads to this mixture of emotions of indecision. When you're in that state, you can't decide because there's too many emotions involved. So it's learning to let go of the things that are not serving you. Toxic people, toxic relationships, toxic belief systems, right? Once you let that go, right, and you no longer use the environment, your environment's just a trigger, right? You can be led to where you want to go.
Interesting. Without using names, can you give examples of these?
Yeah. So I had one lady I was working with, just highly successful. She was in her 40s, and she had, she was, everything in her life was good except for relationships.
Sure.
Right. And then she came to me for session, and she was like, I'm looking for a man that works on Wall Street, makes 7 figures, has a boxer body, right? Who reads poetry at night.
What the hell?
But then also can keep me in check at the same time, right? But who's sensitive, right? So like she was describing like this like ideal man that doesn't exist, right?
Well, in Twilight, you have Edward.
You have Edward,
so,
though.
Okay.
Okay, I take it back.
I mean,
but so she would like meet men, and she would never have a relationship more than like 2 months, right?
yeah.
And then so then I asked her like, okay, let's say you met a man like that, right? And then what if he said to you, I want a 20-year-old supermodel that graduated from Harvard, that cooks and cleans, that's really smart. And then even though she has, even though we have kids, she looks good all the time. And then she was like, oh, but I'm really special, right? So we started digging, right? We started digging into her, like her relationship patterns. If you look at her past, her dad was never around. Her dad left, right? So she was like the caretaker of her family.
Yeah.
And then she saw photos of her dad, right? Who was like this playboy guy. So she like idealized what her father was because she never met him, right?
Yeah.
So then when she went on dates, right, she would seek out this ideal of a man, right? And then she then would start to like, she's a very assertive woman. You have to be very assertive to be that successful, right?
Sure.
She would start to try to be very like, stereotypical feminine and be more passive in those relationships. And they would just flounder, right? So she was drawn to these like men that would treat her bad. And then when she would get into relationships where like the person was really nice, they appreciate her assertiveness, she would push them away.
Interesting.
Right? And then because her pleasure sensors and her pain was drawn to that ideal because that was a daddy issue, right? Like she never addressed it, right? And then once we started working together, then there was a man that came back in her life. And then she was like, the guy was like doing his game, and she was like, oh my God. And she was like, and she told me when she came to session, she's like, I told myself, I'm chasing my fucking daddy.
Yeah.
I'm chasing my fucking daddy, right? So all those pleasure sensors were on. She's like, oh my God, I'm going to go back with him. And then she didn't, right? So then all of those like emotions after that next day, she broke it off with him. And then she broke off all relationships after that, right? And then she started realizing like, look, you don't need this strong man, because if you find someone like that, you're going to fight all the time, right?
Sure.
You need someone that complements you more and allows you to be the strong person that you are, right? And then once she started doing that, she healed her pain. She recognized who she is as a person today. She got married.
That's so interesting. Did that mindset carry over into her friendships too, or was it primarily that she was looking at a partner in that way?
I mean, she had friendships that were like negative about relationships, but they were successful. But yeah, they all had this very negative tone of relationships.
Yeah.
And then like they would tell stories where they, it's in their mind, look how awesome I am. But if you look at it in reality, it was like, that was not the best thing that you did.
That's such an interesting thing. I could listen to stories of your clients all day long, I feel.
But that's an emotional trigger, right? That's an example of a trigger.
Yep.
And then once you work through it, then she knew what she wanted, right? So she went from like 2 months, 3 months max of a relationship to getting married.
Yeah. That's pretty wild. I mean, a lot of people in those situations would say, like, if they're not ready to listen to what you're saying, they would say, I don't want to compromise. I don't want to, lower my standards type thing. But you're getting that through in a way that it doesn't come that, or are they prepared to listen?
Well, I mean, it's confrontational. Like, she was really pissed at me. Like,
Okay.
when I told her that, she was like, okay, like, she was pissed at first, and we had to work through that anger, right?
Yeah.
Because, it was a shift in what I did before. Like, before I'd have been like, oh yeah, like, it just didn't work out, and let's do this. But then later, once I started using this model, I was like, no, that's a pain point, and your expectations are unreasonable because you're idealizing this man. It looks like it's coming from your past, right? And then we broke down all the emotions that were involved with all these different men, and she was able to break through.
Interesting. It's such a strange set of characteristics to imagine that one person could have, because immediately if you are the person that she is describing, there are certain things that you are not characteristically by that. Like if you are a high power Wall Street person, you're probably not going to be the person that is sensitive and reading poetry and each of those things. So and likewise, if you're the playboy, you're not going to be the person that's like, those things don't generally go together. So that's pretty wild. Okay.
Or like, just in general, like, this was like a way back, but like, I was at a bar with some friends, and then, one of the girls, she was like, well, there's this one guy, he's just really nice, but then, he's just kind of boring. And then they're like, ha ha ha. But then this guy's really exciting, right? He's really exciting. And, there's just something about him. There's a magnetism about him. But then, and then she ends up with that person, but she's like, why can't I have a normal relationship? And why can't they settle down? You had that opportunity, but you're still in that pain point. That's why you chose that person, right? So it's really taking ownership of your emotions and your choices.
Yeah. That one's an interesting one. I wrote about this concept of risk. Did you see that part in the?
Yes.
I think it's in the first few chapters.
Yes.
Risk is a funny one because Esther Perel had a really great kind of a book on this entire subject. But when we're talking about a friendship or any type of significant relationship, there's always that beginning discovery phase where there's plenty of what I referred to as risk in the relationship. Like you don't know where everything's going. It's not anything secure. It's just something exciting, something to explore. There's just a lot of unknown there. It tends to, in each relationship, it tends to drop away because I don't think that people realize that it's an important part of a relationship. Like that ongoing unknown is important. So they drown it out with like their need to be secure. They want, verbal security, like verbal reassurance, like we're good. We're all, they want, physical reassurance. They want the comfort of like, okay, every night we do the same thing. We are at home and we have this routine.
Right.
And so they gradually destroy risk in their relationship. And then they wonder, well, where did the excitement go type thing?
Right.
Do you see that commonly occurring? And if so, how do you guide people through it?
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know if this answers the question, but I see a lot of, people in relationships when they come in, they're like, we just don't want to fight. So then the whole goal is let's not fight. And then let's keep things really rational, right? And as long as we do that, we can solve this problem, right?
Interesting.
And then so that becomes the source of their marriage. And then, the routines will keep us from not fighting. Knowing things will keep us from not fighting. But to me, you're seeking so much security and this rationalistic approach because you're not dealing with your pain points. Because once you go there, right, and once you break this routine, both of your pains are going to come out and you have to work on it.
Why do you feel like people are so afraid of conflict? Because naturally, if you look at any aspect of life, conflict is a regular part of getting to something better. So why is it that they don't see that in terms of relationship. And I don't mean bad conflict. I mean just the standard everyday conflict.
I mean, I think it's languaging, but once again, once your nervous system enters your emotional world, everything is seen as dangerous, right? So that tiger is a life or death situation, right?
I see.
But then, people use language like, oh, my boss is going to kill me. Oh, if this relationship is over, I'm dead, right?
Yeah.
So languaging, and once it enters your emotional world, conflict is death. Right?
Interesting.
Right. So it's a similar survival state, right? Versus, and this is the thing, emotions, the strong emotions, they're not irrational. They are there to serve you. They are pain points that will help you break that cycle of trauma, triggers, and toxicity.
Do you find, how often does religion come into play in each of these, in your counseling sessions?
It can be huge. Like, I had one Mormon client, and then she was sexually abused by one of the parishioners.
Oh, I see.
And then so they were, she was told that, forgive.
Oh my gosh.
Right. And then she was feeling all this excessive guilt. Right. And then she was questioning whether this was the right religion for her. So like, it was just a lot of work through. Like, so instead of like validating her feelings, and especially the trigger she was going through, she'd be told like, you're not following God, or whatever the case may be. Once she came in, I was like, no, this is dogma free. Like, you can feel and express whatever you want to feel and express.
Yeah. I mean, this is an interesting, the more I've gotten into personal development, the more that I've stepped into this space, the more I felt like I had to step away from religion. Are you a religious person?
I mean, I believe in spirituality. So
that's where I'm at too.
Yeah. Like, I don't believe in a particular religion. This is how I see spirituality. Like, to me, like the reason I wrote this book is it's a Venn diagram of like psychology and then like spirituality. And to me, spirituality is that life is a mirror, right? So everything that you have in your life reflects where you are, where you are in life. So when I was in that toxic environment, getting threats, that was reflective of my internal state, my emotional state at that time.
Yeah.
Right. So then, I'm in a better state now. So, so basically that is what spirituality is to me. Like, every day is an opportunity to assess where you're at and to make changes.
I like that approach, and I'm very much in that same space of mind as far as like I want to maintain my spirituality, not in the cliche sense of the word, like I do yoga and meditate, but like legit, you have your own belief system and whatnot. But I've found that like it's difficult. I haven't met very many people who are religious, and I mean like actively religious, and also kind of rational, self-development minded individuals. There seems to always be this, and I did it myself, there seems to always be this justification. Like being in that instance, to me, the scum of the earth is the person that will molest, rape, and then use religion to basically support their behavior. But for somebody in that, you don't have to be that extreme by any means. But I find that people often use their religion to justify not changing, not doing something, not, whatever it might be. And it's very difficult to like have just regular conversations with.
Oh, absolutely. And then it promotes a lot of groupthink a lot of times. So that's why when people ask questions like, well, what about this? Or I don't believe this, or, they're attacked and told like, hey, what's wrong with you, right?
Yeah.
This is the devil, or whatever the case may be, right? So yeah, if it gets to a place where it's this group-oriented mentality and it becomes toxic, it's definitely not healthy.
Have you met a lot of people that have balanced those two worlds well?
Yeah, I mean, to me, like, the people that truly believe in what they believe in, yeah, it works for them. It works for them because like their values of religion, like what they personally believe, it all falls in line. And then their own psychology fits that. So it fits that personality type. But if you're kind of like a person that, maybe you're more individualistic or you're questioning things more, it probably won't,
Yeah, I've come to kind of experience and realize that going back to that whole idea of values, we tend to tie our values to these external things, what culture you're from, your wealth status, your financial position, your religion. And in reality, we each have very different reasons for why we're doing those things.
Mm-hmm.
Like if we're talking about religion, how many people are there because of their parents? How many are there because filial piety, they just want to respect the people that came before them? How many are there because they just feel less guilty than, you know, they would if they didn't go? And how many are there truly because they genuinely want to learn and they're on a spiritual path? Each of those underlying values dictates kind of the behavior that they have there as well as away from that place. And we tend to lump them all together like, nope, you're in the same building. You believe in the same religion, therefore you have the same values. Or flip that, you know, into you're a doctor, therefore all doctors are good and they all want to, and it's not the case. It's not the case where, you know, there's plenty of doctors who got into it just for the money. There's plenty of doctors who got into it for notoriety. There's plenty of doctors that genuinely want to help people. They go across the spectrum. So what do you do with all these shortcuts that people have held on to so long?
But I think that goes back to, you know, what we were talking about earlier. There's two values. There's the intellectual value that people hold. Like, you know, the example of going to church, right? People may go for different pain points, right? They're trying to alleviate suffering or, you know, they're doing it for their family dynamics or whatever the case may be, right? So I think it's really important to identify what is your emotional value, you know, and those come up during times of like intimacy or things that are important to you. So it's really important to address.
Interesting. Well, I've had a fantastic time on this conversation, Glenn.
Thank you.
I look forward to doing another one maybe sometime in the future.
Absolutely.
If you're down.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, in the meantime, we're going to close up here and go hang out, go do something. I was going to say it'd be good to get lunch, but it's kind of early for lunch. So
An early lunch, a weekday brunch.
So in the meantime, we're going to link up Glen's work. So you guys can check everything out at thatguyshouse.com. Glen Hong, if you guys are watching the video, we will include the links as well. So they can actually hire you to be a coach. And I'm assuming that you do in-person as well as Zoom-based coaching and counseling.
Zoom, individual couples. We're going to set up workshops as well. So there's a lot of exciting things coming up.
That's rad. And when does the book come out? Do you have a publishing date?
It's June 10th. So you can pre-order right now. But if you go down on the link, there's like Amazon links, but any Amazon site, you can pre-order the book.
Very cool. Yeah. I'm excited to read it, dude.
Thank you.
I can't wait. We didn't even talk about the publishing process. You self-published this, right?
No, I actually went through That Guy's House.
Oh, That Guy's House. Okay,
Yeah.
I didn't realize that was the publisher.
Yeah, so they're the publishing company.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I'm excited for it, and after I read it, I'll have to have you back on, and we'll have to chat about it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This is a pleasure.
Yeah, it's great having you, Glenn.
Thank you.